Every time you start a new game in Skyrim, one of the first decisions you're asked to make is your race, and it's a choice that sparked debates for well over a decade. The truth is, there isn't a single race in Skyrim that's completely unplayable. Bethesda actually did a pretty good job at making sure every race has something unique to offer, whether that's a powerful racial ability, useful resistances, or starting skills that help to shape your character in the early game. But that doesn't mean that every race is equally strong. Some racial abilities stay useful for your entire playthrough, while others become almost completely irrelevant after the first 10 or 20 levels. Some races specialize in one specific build and absolutely dominate it, while others are flexible enough to work well with almost any character you can imagine. So today, I'm going to be ranking every race in Skyrim from worst to best. This ranking is going to be strictly about gameplay, but most importantly, how viable each race is throughout the entire playthrough. Let's count down every playable race in Skyrim from the absolute worst to the absolute best. Coming in at number 10, I have the Imperials. To be quite honest, I don't even think that this one is close. Now, before everyone starts calling me crazy in the comments, let me make one thing very clear. The Imperial race isn't bad. There really aren't any bad races in Skyrim. The problem is that when you compare the Imperials to every other race in the game, they have by far the weakest collection of racial abilities. They're the definition of a race that sounds useful on paper, but ends up feeling completely forgettable once you actually start playing. Starting with their racial ability, Imperial Luck, this passive simply gives you more gold while adventuring. And honestly speaking, it's easily one of the weakest passive abilities in the entire game. Not because gold is useless, but because it's so incredibly easy to get, especially in the late game. There are enchanted items you can sell, overpowered potions that you can get money from, and a bunch of quests that add up over time to make it so that gold is never really a concern. By the time you're level 20 or 30, it's completely normal to have 50,000 gold sitting in your inventory with absolutely nothing meaningful to spend it on. Imperial Luck simply speeds up something that was already going to happen naturally. Then we have Voice of the Emperor. Once per day, nearby humanoids become calm for 60 seconds. Now, there are situations where this can save your life, but that's also the problem. You're escaping the fight, you're not really winning it. There are several strong racial powers in Skyrim that help you overcome difficult encounters. Voice of the Emperor simply presses the pause button. Eventually, those enemies become hostile again. You still have to deal with them, and it only works on humanoids. So while Voice of the Emperor isn't completely useless, it's one of those powers players constantly forget even exist. Imperials begin with plus 10 restoration, along with plus 5 in block, destruction, enchanting, heavy armor, and one-handed. It's fine. It's okay. There's really no better way to describe it. Nothing about this skill spread is bad, but nothing about it is exciting either. Coming in at number 9, we have the Argonians. Now, I know this is probably going to be one of the more controversial placements on this list because Argonians have one of the most loyal fan bases in the entire Elder Scrolls community. Let's start with probably their most iconic passive ability, water breathing. This allows Argonians to stay underwater indefinitely without ever running out of oxygen. The first time you hear that, it sounds incredible. You immediately start imagining hidden underwater caves, secret treasure chests, and entire sections of Skyrim that only Argonians can explore. The reality is a little disappointing. Skyrim simply doesn't have enough underwater content for this ability to actually matter. Most lakes and rivers are relatively shallow, and even when there is something hidden underwater, every other race can usually swim down, grab the loot, and come back up long before they run out of breath. It's one of those abilities that sound amazing on paper, but rarely has any meaningful impact during an actual playthrough. Their second passive is 50% disease resistance. This is definitely more useful than water breathing, especially during the early game. Diseases lower your skills, weaken your character, and can definitely become frustrating if you don't notice them. The problem is that curing diseases in Skyrim is incredibly easy. Every major city has shrines that remove diseases for free and cure disease potions that are everywhere. Once you really know how the game works, diseases stop being something you worry about almost entirely. So while disease resistance is nice to have, it ends up solving solving a problem that experienced players rarely struggle with. Now, let's talk about the Argonians' racial power, Hist Skin. This is easily the best thing about this race. Once per day for 60 seconds, your health regenerates 10 times faster, and this ability can be incredibly helpful. It's especially powerful during the early and mid game where your health pool is relatively small and every point of regeneration matters. But here's where I think people tend to overrate it. Hist Skin is reactive. It helps you recover from a bad situation, it doesn't help you end the fight faster. Compare that to Berserker Rage, which doubles your damage while cutting incoming damage in half, or Dragon Skin that completely shuts down enemy spellcasters, or Highborn, which lets mages continuously cast during difficult encounters. Those abilities actively swing fights in your favor. Hist Skin simply helps you survive them. It's absolutely useful, but I don't think it's quite on the same level as some of the stronger racial powers higher up on this list. Argonians begin with bonuses in lockpicking, pickpocket, light armor, alteration, restoration, and sneak. There's nothing inherently wrong with those skills. In fact, they fit the idea of a stealthy survivalist quite well. The issue is that they don't naturally push you towards one particular powerful build. Argonians feel a little scattered. You can certainly build them into anything you want, but their starting bonuses don't provide the same sense of direction, and that's why I have them coming in at number 9. Coming in at number 8, we have the Redguards. Now, I have a feeling this placement is going to upset some people because Redguards have one of the strongest reputations in Elder Scrolls history, but when it comes to Skyrim's gameplay, I think they end up just being good. Just good. Let's start with their passive ability, which is 50% poison resistance. Now, unlike diseases, poison can actually be a serious problem in Skyrim. You'll be winning a fight, then suddenly your health starts melting because you've got a lingering poison effect ticking away in the background. Having that 50% resistance definitely helps smooth out those encounters. The problem is that poison just isn't common enough to be considered one of Skyrim's biggest threats. Now, let's talk about what most people remember the Redguards for, which is adrenaline rush. Once per day, your stamina regenerates 10 times faster for 60 seconds. And honestly speaking, during the early game, this power is actually fantastic. When you're fresh out of Helgen with barely any stamina, every power attack feels expensive. If you're using a two-handed weapon or a sword and shield, you'll constantly find yourself backing away from enemies while your stamina slowly crawls back. Adrenaline Rush completely removes that problem. For 1 full minute, you can chain together powerful attacks, shield bashes, sprint across the battlefield, and generally fight without worrying about your stamina bar at all. Against dragons, giants, or difficult boss fights, it can make an enormous difference. The problem is, stamina eventually becomes the easiest resource in Skyrim to manage. Once you've played the game for a while, you'll realize there are countless ways to solve stamina issues. You can enchant gear with Fortify stamina regeneration, you can drink stamina potions, you can invest level ups into stamina, or you can just drink some soup. Health keeps you alive. Magicka determines what spells you can cast. Stamina eventually becomes more of a convenience than a necessity. That's why Adrenaline Rush is one of those racial powers that starts incredibly strong, but slowly loses value as your character progresses. Looking at their starting skills, Redguards begin with a massive plus 10 bonus to one-handed, along with plus 5 in smithing, archery, block, destruction, and alteration. That plus 10 one-handed bonus is honestly one of the better starting bonuses in the game. If you're planning on using swords, axes, or maces, you'll notice the difference immediately. The rest of their skills, however, are a little bit more scattered. It's not a bad spread by any means, it just lacks the focused identity that some of the higher ranked races have. Coming in at number 7, we have the Khajiit. Honestly speaking, this was probably the hardest race to place on this entire list, because on one hand, the Khajiit have some incredibly unique abilities that no other race has. They're one of the most recognizable races in all of the Elder Scrolls, and they're arguably the best role-playing race in Skyrim. But on the other hand, most of their racial abilities are either extremely niche or become less relevant the longer you play. Let's start with what everyone knows the Khajiit for, their claws. Khajiit deal 12 points of unarmed damage, making them by far the strongest race for fist fighting. If you've ever tried an unarmed playthrough before, choosing a Khajiit as your race is almost non-negotiable. The problem is, almost almost nobody plays Skyrim that way. The vast majority of players eventually pick up a sword, a bow, or a spell, and the moment you do that, your claws become completely irrelevant. They're incredibly fun, they're just incredibly specialized. Then we have Night Eye. Once per day, you can greatly improve your vision in dark environments. This is probably one of the most divisive racial powers in Skyrim. Some people absolutely swear by it, some almost never use it. Valuing it highly seems to be a mistake though, because Skyrim gives you so many other ways to solve the exact same problem. You have torches, you have candlelight, you have mage light. Many players simply increase their game's brightness settings. There have honestly been entire playthroughs where I completely forgot Night Eye even existed. Now let's talk about their starting skills, because this is actually where the Khajiit begin to shine. They start with plus 10 sneak, along with plus 5 in archery, lockpicking, pickpocket, one-handed, and alchemy. This race is practically screaming at you to become a thief or assassin, and honestly, that's exactly what they're good at. The plus 10 sneak bonus is one of the strongest starting skill bonuses in the game. Sneak is notoriously difficult to level during the first few hours, so getting that head start makes an immediate difference. Pair that with archery and one-handed, and you've basically got the foundation for Skyrim's most infamous build, the Stealth Archer. Coming in at number 6, we have the Dark Elves. At this point in the list, this is where the races really get good. Unlike the races we've talked about so far, the Dark Elves don't really have any wasted abilities. Everything they bring to the table has a purpose, and more importantly, these abilities stay relevant from the moment you escape Helgen all the way into the late game. That being said, I also don't think they have one defining ability that completely changes the way you play Skyrim. Instead, they're one of the most well-balanced and versatile races in the entire game. Let's start with their passive ability, 50% fire resistance. Out of all 3 elemental resistances in Skyrim, fire is one of the most consistently useful. Even many of the environmental hazards throughout Skyrim revolve around fire. It's a passive that simply never stops being useful. Moving on to their racial power, Ancestor's Wrath, once per day you can surround yourself in flames for 60 seconds, dealing fire damage every second to nearby enemies. Honestly speaking, this power is a little bit better than people give it credit for. Many players look at the damage numbers and immediately write it off because the damage isn't particularly high. And they're entirely right, it isn't going to delete enemies by itself, but that's also not really what it's designed to do. Ancestor's Wrath works best when you're playing aggressively. If you're using a sword and a shield, dual wielding, swinging an axe, or even fighting up close as a battle mage, enemies are constantly standing next to you. That means that they're taking passive fire damage while you're already attacking them normally. It's not overpowered, but it's surprisingly effective. That being said, I don't think it's one of Skyrim's strongest racial powers. It's solid, reliable, and useful, but not incredible. Now let's talk about the Dark Elves' starting skills. The Dark Elves are built to succeed with almost any combat style. They start with plus 10 destruction, along with plus 5 in light armor, sneak, alchemy, illusion, and alteration. Nearly all of those skills can help provide a solid start to your mage playthrough, and that's why I have the Dark Elves coming in at number 6. Coming in at number 5, we have the Nords. This is where we officially move into the upper half of Skyrim's races. At this point, every race left on this list has abilities that I genuinely enjoy having throughout an entire playthrough. Gameplay-wise, Nords are actually much stronger than a lot of people give them credit for. Let's start with their passive ability, 50% resistance to frost. Sometimes it can be difficult to fully appreciate just how often you're hit with frost damage in Skyrim. Once you really start paying attention, you realize it's everywhere. There are several types of dragons, frost atronachs, ice wraiths, frost mages, and countless Draugr deathlords that love throwing ice spikes and ice storms at you. But what really makes frost dangerous isn't just the damage, it's the stamina drain. If you're playing a warrior, stamina is your lifeline. It's what allows you to sprint, shield bash, block effectively, and perform power attacks. Getting hit by frost magic doesn't just hurt your health, it cripples your ability to fight back. By cutting all that frost damage in half, Nords become significantly more comfortable to play against a huge portion of Skyrim's enemies. And unlike some resistances we've already talked about, this one stays useful forever. Talking about their racial power battle cry, once per day, nearby enemies flee in fear for 30 seconds. Now, is it as powerful as Berserker Rage? Not even close. but it's still a very useful ability that can save difficult encounters. Looking at the Nords' starting skills, they begin with plus 10 to two-handed, along with plus 5 in block, light armor, one-handed, smithing, and speech. This skill spread is actually really good. It perfectly captures what the Nord is supposed to be, which is a warrior. Whether you're swinging a greatsword, using a battle axe, or fighting with a sword and shield, the Nord immediately feels comfortable, and that's why they're sitting comfortably in the number 5 spot. Coming in at number 4, we have the Wood Elves. After countless Skyrim playthroughs, it becomes easier to appreciate just how good the Wood Elves actually are. Let's start with their passive abilities. They have 50% poison resistance and 50% disease resistance. Now, I'll be honest, disease resistance by itself isn't particularly exciting. As mentioned with the Argonians, diseases are incredibly easy to cure. The poison resistance, however, is much more useful. It's one of those passives that's always nice to have, and so the fact that poison and disease resistance is bundled into this race makes it slightly more desirable. Now let's talk about their racial power, Command Animal. Once per day, you can force nearby animals to fight alongside you for 60 seconds. This is probably the weakest part of the Wood Elf kit. Not because it's useless, but because it's inconsistent. Sometimes this ability is fantastic, but then there are plenty of situations where it does absolutely nothing. The majority of Skyrim's major quest lines don't actually involve fighting animals. So while Command Animal is definitely fun and honestly pretty satisfying when you remember to use it, it's probably one of the more situational racial powers in the entire game. What really makes this race shine is their starting skills. They begin with plus 10 archery, along with plus 5 in sneak, light armor, lockpicking, pickpocket, and alchemy. This is one of the strongest skill spreads in the entire game. They're not the strongest race overall, but if your favorite way to play Skyrim involves picking enemies off from the shadows before they ever even know you're there, there's a very strong argument that no race does it better. And that's why I have the Wood Elves coming in at number 4. Coming in at number 3 are the High Elves. This is the point where we go from races that are simply strong to races that are genuinely overpowered. If your goal in Skyrim is to become a mage, there isn't another race that even comes close to the High Elf. Let's start with the passive ability that makes the High Elf so famous. High Elves begin the game with 50 extra magicka. Now, I know that doesn't sound like much at first. 50 points doesn't seem game-changing when you eventually have 300 or 400 magicka by the end of the game. But during the early game, those 50 points are enormous. The biggest problem every new mage runs into isn't damage, it's running out of magicka. You'll cast 3 or 4 spells, completely empty your magicka bar, and suddenly you're standing there with nothing but an iron dagger while you wait for it to regenerate. The High Elf almost completely solves that problem. Now, let's talk about their racial power, Highborn. This may be one of the strongest racial powers in the entire game. Once per day, your magicka regenerates 25 times faster for 60 seconds. If you're playing a mage, you know how absurd this ability actually is. For an entire minute, you can cast almost continuously. Destruction spells, healing spells, summons, whatever your build revolves around, Highborn lets you keep casting long after every other race would have been forced to stop. Now, let's take a look at their starting skills. They begin with plus 10 illusion, along with plus 5 in alteration, conjuration, destruction, enchanting, and restoration. If there was ever a race whose starting skills perfectly matched its identity, it's the High Elf. Every single one of these skills revolves around magic. Nothing feels out of place, and nothing feels wasted. Whether you're becoming a destruction mage, a conjurer, a healer, or even an illusion assassin, the High Elf gives you an immediate head start. If your goal is to create the ultimate mage, there isn't a better choice. The High Elf is the undisputed king of magic, but the next two races, they're simply incredible no matter how you choose to play, and that's why I have the High Elves coming in at number 3. Coming in at number 2, we have the Bretons. This was a psychotically hard decision when ranking. If someone told me they think Bretons are the strongest race in Skyrim, I honestly wouldn't argue with them very much. They're that good. We're talking about a race whose abilities remain useful from level 1 all the way to the end of the game. Let's talk about what makes them so incredible. Their passive ability grants 25% magic resistance, and I cannot overstate just how ridiculously powerful this is. is. The first time you read it, 25% doesn't sound particularly impressive until you realize how much of Skyrim revolves around magic. Think about some of the toughest enemies in the entire game: dragon priests, necromancers, master vampires, even dragons themselves. Almost every major threat in Skyrim has some form of magical attack. Moving on to their racial power, dragon skin, once per day for 60 seconds you absorb 50% of the magicka from hostile spells. They refill your own magicka. It's one of the coolest racial powers in the game because it completely flips certain encounters on their head. Talking about the Bretons' starting skills, they begin with plus 10 conjuration, along with plus 5 in restoration, alteration, alchemy, illusion, and speech. Those starting skills provide much better survivability in the early game and all seem to fit well with a mage-specific playthrough. Another reason the Breton is so highly ranked is because their passive isn't locked to just one specific build. Sure, they're clearly designed to be mages, but unlike the High Elf, magic resistance helps literally everyone. No matter what kind of character you create, you'll always benefit from taking less magic damage. The only reason they don't take the #1 spot is because there's one race whose racial powers are so absurdly powerful that it can completely trivialize some of Skyrim's hardest encounters. If the Breton is the king of defense, the race at #1 is the king of offense. And once you use that ability for the first time, you'll immediately understand why there couldn't be anything else put at the top of this list. Finally, coming in at #1, we have the Orc. When we ask ourselves one simple question, which race gives me the biggest advantage in actual gameplay? The answer is almost always Orc, and for one reason: Berserker Rage. Berserker Rage is the single strongest racial ability in all of Skyrim. Once per day, Berserker Rage causes you to deal double damage while taking half damage for 60 seconds. You hit enemies twice as hard. That's not a small bonus, that's an absolutely insane swing in your favor. Now, a lot of people hear double damage and immediately assume this is only a race for warriors. Yes, they're incredible melee fighters, but Berserker Rage works with far more builds than people realize. Playing as a stealth archer, your bow does double damage. Now, if you're playing a pure destruction mage, this is really one area where the Orc isn't the absolute best. Berserker Rage does not increase the damage of destruction spells. So if your entire build revolves around throwing fireballs from the back of the room, races like the High Elf or Breton would probably serve you better. But for almost every physical combat style in Skyrim, the Orc is simply unmatched. Looking at their starting skills, they start with plus 10 to heavy armor, along with plus 5 in smithing, block, enchanting, one-handed, and two-handed. Everything works together, and all of these skills can completely transform your character. That makes the Orc the strongest playable race in Skyrim, and that's why they take the #1 spot on this list. Every race is viable and every build can become incredibly powerful. Your favorite race is probably going to depend on how you enjoy playing the game. What's your #1 race in Skyrim? And more importantly, which placement do you think is completely wrong? Let me know down in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel before embarking on your next quest.